Welcome to That Career Coast podcast. Today, we are talking about how to be successful as a woman in tech. We're talking with podcast host Rachel Varkey of the It's Fine podcast. They're geared towards helping women live a life that is just more than fine, right? Fine is fine. It's not good enough. So we're excited to have you on the show, Rachel. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here, Kendall. And I will say had such a great time chatting with you on my podcast, and this is why we decided to do, a conversation on tech on yours. But as Kendall mentioned, I help women imagine a life where they can be better than fine. Like, you might have caught yourself like slapping and it's fine whenever you're talking to your friend about like, oh my God, this really crazy thing is happening to me at work, but it's fine. It's whatever. I want women to challenge their it's fines belief. Like, life can be better than fine, and there's so many areas all across the board that we accept just fine in, right? Our relationships, our mental health, and I think definitely in the workplace and in our professional lives.
Well, I think it's so funny because like, I will accept that's fine for a lot of things. It's fine weather, it's a fine day for a walk. I will not accept a fine cup of coffee. Like, it better be a great cup of coffee because I need it to fuel my sanity for today.
For sure.
So I love applying that kind of methodology to the rest of your life. But as somebody who is in tech, in education, I'd love to hear what's something, that you were not expecting about the industry and about the type of work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. So, not only am I a podcast host like Kendall, but I also have been in the tech world for over 10 years at this point. And I started my career at a big company at Amazon, if you're familiar with it. And I've sort of walked my way through lots of different kinds of companies. I've been at like smaller, kind of more traditional corporate environments, been in the startup world, have played in the ed tech space primarily. But I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, and I was sharing with Kendall before we got, recording, is that I'm often super humbled by the systemic challenges in the industry, right? Mm-hmm. I think we think, especially when we're entering into the workforce, that like, obviously these companies totally get what they're doing. They totally understand what's going on. My leaders will always get it, right? And then I came into the industry and realized like, I think my leaders know sometimes less than me, maybe a little bit more than me. Sometimes the people running companies totally know what they're doing. Sometimes they're just taking it day by day, right? And I think it's a very, I think it's a misconception to come in and you finally realize like, oh, like, we're all just like navigating through this world of work, at whatever level that we're at, with just the knowledge and experiences, whether it be within our industries, within the work that we do, or even just kind of like the macro economy, right? And I think this particular moment in time is showing us that, as we see like huge companies that we think have it all together, having to really evaluate like how they're going to survive in these micro and macro economic conditions, right? And I think sometimes it's easy to be like, oh yeah, like, it's the economy. It's totally the economy. But there were a lot of decisions that were made, right, that got these companies to have to reevaluate where they are today. And a lot of that is systemic. It's a lot to do with the way that we evaluate success in companies, the way we evaluate our leaders, who gets what type of resources, right? And like what communities and systems receive and are giving out those resources, right? And I think it's really important to remember that like these companies are in the world, and the same challenges that we face as individuals in the world, right? Like whether they be, gender, race, equity, all these different challenges, we're also experiencing them in companies too, right? And it's just it's another layer that we just have to think about when we're in tech. And I have definitely, after 10 years, I'm like, okay, how do I focus on me? Because I'm not going to personally be able to challenge these systemic challenges. And while we can do them in small ways in our workplace, they're really big and they're kind of monstrous. Like, it's not easy to just like solve them or even really like understand like what the right solutions are.
Yeah. No, and it's so true that, companies are really winging it a little bit. And I did a study, and this was for a speaking engagement last year, but almost every power CEO that you hear about, right? So think like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, any of the big ones, their first companies failed. And a lot of them, their second companies failed, and maybe their third companies failed. Like, this is not I woke up and knew what I was doing and I was brilliant and I walked into the space and I crushed it. Yeah. And so that's why I think so often people think of these executive leaders as like almost superheroes, like
larger than life.
Wrong. and they have all the power and they know all the right decisions to make. And the reality is that they're just like, I don't know, maybe this will work. What if we try it? Right? Like Netflix. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. When they first started, they're like, hey, we'll ship you a DVD, which was like so iconic. And then they introduced streaming. You had to have a separate membership. You couldn't get DVDs and stream. Well, at the time, streaming wasn't really an option on all TVs. And they realized very quickly, like, oh, no, we need to have these back together. So they had built a separate company. Then they brought it back in. They kind of squished it. They were like, it's fine. Because a lot of the time they're trying stuff, too. Like, they're like, oh, this seems like a great idea. And then they test it. And they're like, this is not a great idea. We must undo this.
Right.
Bring it back in.
Well, it's funny, too, because I think in the midst of all of that, right, what I would say about those CEOs and just like generally what I've learned in my career, right, is like you just have to be really aware of how you're strategically building your personal capital, right? Mm-hmm. Both like the relationships that you have, how you market and package yourself, right? And then just like how you show up at work to have that authority, have that respect, right? I think that's really the only thing that you can control. Because when I think about these CEOs, you know, they might have had 3 failed companies, right? Whatever, right? There's a lot of failure in the professional workplace. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. It just means that you're learning and you're growing and that you're finding opportunities to succeed. And oftentimes like knowing that and then be really thoughtful about, well, how do I kind of craft my own personal story, my own personal narrative in the workplace? Like that's really what's helped me be successful, right? In tech. I don't think it's necessarily that like, you know, I'm the best worker. I always know what I'm doing. I think I've built a personal capital and a personal story that I fortunately have been able to have people rally behind and really connect to me in that way. And I'm sure those same CEOs and those same folks that we really respect and admire have probably built that network of folks that believe in them, right? Who are willing to cut them that check to try the next idea.
Yeah. And it's so great that you talk about building your brand, right? Because there's who you are, and then there's how you're perceived. And you have a lot more control over how you're perceived than you think, depending on what actions you're taking. And one of the biggest things I talk about with clients is not panicking. Right? If you've ever worked for a senior leader who panics, like it is the most volatile work environment because you know, like if something goes wrong, like they cannot handle it. And the same is true at every level of seniority. That if you can build a brand that like, hey, I may fail, but I'm going to stay calm. I'm going to carry on. I hate that saying. Stay calm. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to fix it. And then I'm going to move on to the next thing. Even if that's your brand, so many more people are willing to rally behind that and support you and grow you than somebody who fails and panics. And it's like, well, I'll just give up then.
Totally. I mean, I think it's something that like, is so challenging in the workplace because you just feel like you can't be your authentic self. And honestly, I don't personally believe that. I think that you have to be careful about how much you expose of yourself to any environment that you're in, right? Like you don't need to gush your soul and heart in the workplace, right? Like that might not necessarily be like where your connections are, like, you know, where you're having like those deep, meaningful connections, right? But you can carry, you know, I'm a girl from, you know, a suburb of Washington. I try to be myself wherever I am. I'm a person of color, you know, I'm a child of immigrants, and who I am is so important to how I connect with people in the workplace and build my personal brand, right? And I think it's funny. One of the things that I really had to consider, especially when I started building this personal brand, is one trait that I have that I've worked on explicitly in the workplace is I do a little bit of word vomiting, right? I'm an external processor. I'm just thinking out loud, and I'm somebody who needs to just talk it out to get my point across, or maybe even just like understand the problem. And once I understand the problem, I get it, right? I have found that like that external processing does not work in the workplace. Cause you know, to your point, Kendall, a person who panics, you're like, oh, do I trust that person? A person who externally processes, you're like, I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're talking about. Like I'm trying to follow the plot with them, but like I can't. And I found when I was leading teams, like I was just confusing my direct reports. Sometimes I was confusing my senior leaders, right? And I had to really think about like strategies around how could I take this part of myself, like, my husband will laugh at me and be like, oh yeah, you're just like thinking out whatever scenario that we're in at home. And like in my safe space at home, that's totally okay, right? Like my husband is able to kind of do that with me, and we're able to, create space and grace for that, right? But in the workplace, I really had to learn, okay, what are the systems that I can build, right? So that I am not externally processing over my team or over, my senior leaders or whatever, right? And that's really looked like, crafting dedicated time that I'm prepping for meetings, that I've like taking notes and bullet pointing my thoughts, right? So that I'm able to not have this brand of like, oh, Rachel's gonna word mom it all over everybody in a meeting. So be ready for that, right? Like it's really required me, because I knew part of my personal plan was I wanted to be sharp. I wanted to make sure that I would be able to thoroughly and effectively communicate a thought, right? And so I think that's kind of the challenge, right? Is like, what parts of you are valuable in the workplace and you see being effective to your team and in the workspace that you're in, right? And I think that varies depending on the team and like even just like the people that you're around, but really just being thoughtful about how can you take some of the best of yourself into that workspace, right? Whether that be empathy, kindness, right? I think those are the things I've carried in every single job, because that's just the nature of who I am, right? But then in my last job, I really saw how external processing was impacting the rest of my team. And it made me really evaluate, like, is this a quality that I want in my personal brand at this company? Probably not.
And it's so funny that you mentioned that, because so I am a list maker and a list taker. All right, my husband has developed selective hearing over the course of our marriage, because I will list the same 10 things 100 times out loud, because that's the way my brain stays on task. It's like, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then this. And by the 9th time through, he's like, that's great. Is there a bar involved somewhere in your laundry list that we're going to hit? Because we've done this 10 times. And it's funny, because I noticed the same thing at work when I moved into leadership, is because my tendency is to organize and list. It became a very micromanagey type culture in my team, because we got a list, guys. What are you doing? What are you doing? You're on this list, you're on this. And it took a while for me to figure out how to empower them with direction without leading them with a list. Yeah. And I kind of pulled that back. But what's so funny is part of my brand is always, well, Kendall can organize any project. If the project's unorganized, bring in Kendall. She'll have it in a list. It'll be color-coded. We'll know who's doing what in like 15 minutes. Just bring her in. She can run it. And it's like you. It's a part of my personality that I want to be authentic to, but how I represent that to the rest of the people that I engage with and that I work with needs to align with the personal brand that I'm building and how I want to add value in my company. And I think as you have progressed in your career, you've probably learned so many things, right? So not just that the systems in place are being navigated by the company, not just how to kind of rephrase what you do, but what are some of the big material things that you've changed or that you wish you knew earlier in your career that you could have put into practice when you moved into tech?
Well, I think one thing I will share, a friend of mine, my best friend, she always has challenged me in my career, right, to really ask myself a very simple question, but it's a question I ask myself all the time in every job that I'm in. And the question is the role you're in serving you right now, right? And the question means that you're constantly evaluating where you are and whether that role you're in is giving you what you need in the moment, right? So this again comes back to authentic self. There are moments and seasons in your life where like opportunity, career advancement, climbing the corporate ladder, like you want professional success, that's important to you and that's what's serving you now. And that's when you'll choose those types of careers or roles or whatever, right? Sometimes you want more money, right? And so then that depends, like, where do you want to be? Like, are you going to work at a nonprofit or are you going to work, in tech, right? You might want to be surrounded by leaders and ambitious mindsets, right? Sometimes you want to dial it back and you want to focus on other things, right? You might want a slower pace at work. You might want to be able to do more of a 9 to 5, be more of an individual contributor, right? Like you want mental space for your hobbies and your passions, right? Yeah. And so what my friend taught me and what I've carried throughout my career, right, is that I would encourage you to see every career moment as an opportunity to get something out of it for yourself, right? Yes. Remember that your opportunities is a choice. And I think that's something that, you go into the workplace and you think you're just going to get everything that you need, right? And you have to be the arbiter. Yeah, I know. You have to be the arbiter of your happiness and of your joy. And I think that's something that's really important to me, even in my podcast, as I talk about beyond my career, right? Like how I find the better than fine in my mental health, in my self-care, in my relationships, right? And so just to kind of give you guys an example, right, is that I saw every career moment as a new opportunity. And earlier in my career, right, I took way more risks. So I was getting my hands dirty. I learned a ton of different skills. Like I was willing to kind of do anything, honestly, right? Because I was younger in my career and I wanted to learn. And I knew eventually I wanted to be a leader. And I thought that to be an effective leader, I needed to have my hands in lots of different pots and I needed to learn lots of different skills. And, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades marketer, right? So I know a little bit of everything. But because of that, I became a really strong problem solver and I'm able to look at like workplace challenges from many different angles, right? Having worked in smaller places, being willing to roll up my sleeves and really just see like different leadership styles. Right now, I'm like super focused on like where I can find balance because I mentioned before, right? I have these other passions that I'm interested in. And so I tried to find a job where it's a bit more focused on the work that I'm doing and also to continue to build up some skills that I didn't feel super confident in. So I wanted to learn how to become a stronger salesperson. I wanted to become a better, sales forecast, and be able to manage like projections and revenue growth and things like that, right? But then another thing that was really important to me in this moment in my life was my family and like the resources that we had, right? I wanted to be able to have like the benefits and, my family were undergoing fertility treatment. So not every company is able to support, the insurance needs of that type of scenario, right? And so these are all things when I, you think about like, is this company serving you right now? You really have to think about your whole self and your authentic self when you do that.
Yeah. It brings to mind two different things. So when I was first starting out in my career, I had an executive leader who basically told me you should be changing jobs every 6 to 12 months until you hit senior manager level. Like not necessarily companies, but like what type of work you're doing. And he goes, because the more senior you get, the less ability you have to learn those things. You got to learn them early. And to your point, because once you get into a senior leadership role, you naturally kind of niche down, right? You're like a social media influencer. You start with like a really broad scope and over time you kind of focus in on what it is. And it is so true because I did so many things early on in my career, different types of analysis. I worked in different industries. I worked in different organizations, marketing and construction and supply chain. And now it's like a very clear, like the next 3 levels, whether I wanted to do something different or not, they're all going to look pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Because that skill that I've built now sets me up really well for success for these few opportunities. And not that you couldn't make a huge career change, but it's a lot harder the higher up you get, right? And so learning those lessons and those skills early on, that really does empower you to slow down later if you need to, or to make a change, or to hone in on something you're really passionate about. And it gives you the opportunity to figure out what those things are. So I love that advice, especially for anyone who's listening, who's early on in their career, like try all the different stuff.
I think that's like the best. I didn't really know, and I don't know if I still know what I want to be when I grow up. I don't know if a lot of people do, to be honest. But I will say that I'm very grateful that I have learned a lot of different skills, right? I think what that does for you as like a younger in your career, it really opens up a lot of pathways for you. So to give you an example, right? Because I spent a lot of time in, marketing, I feel like I know a ton about marketing. I could take a route in growth. I could take a route in revenue. As I started working in startups, I started realizing like I'm an operator. I love to help execute vision, right? And I learned those things because I was helping across different verticals within my organization. And I saw like, I get so much joy out of like making things happen. Right. And now, I'm a different place in my life. And so I really did decide in this moment of my career, what would serve me as a bit more focus. But I still really thought about, what do I want to be when I grow up? I'd love to lead a company one day. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I strategically kind of picked something where, one, there was like the name brand that I was looking for, right? Just to kind of, for that prestige and recognition. It gave me a lot of like the flexibility in terms of the needs I had for my family. But then it also sort of like set me up so that eventually, the work that I'm doing, I'm still kind of like a jack of all trades at my company. It's just in a much more focused way, right? Yeah. So I knew that like, come a couple years down the line, like if I want to go back to a smaller company and work, in like an operations role or something like that, I do think those doors will open for me, right? And again, I want to like really stress, like this is you taking agency over your career and not the other way around, right? And no one else will do that for you. And I think it's sort of, we think, especially I might think coming into the workplace, right, that there's going to be mentors and there's going to be people guiding you and there's going to be all these people invested in your career. Unfortunately, that has not been my reality. Nope. I think for the most part, people are mostly looking out for them. And like, while I don't always think that's the most kind approach, and I try my best to support my peers and my teams as possible, right? You have to be the arbiter of your success. Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what I hope that you take away from this, right? Is if you're constantly evaluating what is serving you in the moment and what you want, right? The right opportunities will come their way. And even if they're hard, right? Mm-hmm. You'll know that they're getting you to where you need to be.
Yeah. And Rachel, I always think it's interesting because I knew an executive leader who I really respected who used to say all the time, she's like, I've had an accidental career. Like, none of this was on purpose. And in a lot of ways, I really relate to that.
Yeah.
Where, like, I didn't plan. I studied math. Okay. At no point was I like, I'm going to be operational execution in finance and tech. That seems like the path I want to take. Like, that just kind of happened. But there's a very fine line between naturally progressing and playing to your strengths as your career evolves, which is your accidental career, and not taking ownership of it. And that's where it gets risky, because if you're expecting that your boss is going to promote you, your boss is going to give you this opportunity, your boss is going to tell you what you're going to do next, you will not progress. Or if you do, it'll never be in something that like lights a passion in you. It will just be the next step. And so one of the things I work so often with my clients is defining your passion statements. Like, what gives you satisfaction at work? And it's not a task thing. To your point, I don't have to be in this specific job title to be good at my job, but there are certain things I need to be doing to feel satisfied. Like you had mentioned, I want to work cross-collaboratively. I want to have an operational impact. I want to be client-facing and have that sales experience. Like, you need those things to feel satisfaction, even if it is in a more focused way or if it's in a broad scope. And for me, I have to see the end impact of my work. So I'm very internal process focused because I want to be able to walk up to somebody and say, hey, did that work? Did it look the way it was supposed to look? Did you like it? Was it better? And I have found that internally facing teams work better for me. And so it's so interesting because if you are being strategic earlier on in your career and learning a lot of things, you're not just learning different tasks you can complete, you're learning about yourself and what you like.
Yeah.
So that you can apply that later.
I will say, so, not to, toot coaching's horn or anything like that, but I will say coaching was the biggest and most important like anchor point in my career. So there was a point in my career where I thought I was super lost, right? Like, and honestly, like, this goes beyond just like your professional life, because your career, especially as a woman, because we have to be real, right? Like, there are certain elements of being a heteronormative woman, right? I'll just speak because I am a heteronormative woman, right? That I am constantly thinking about in my head as I age, right? So when I actually pursued coaching, right, I had been telling my husband basically every night, like, I feel very lost because I knew that I wanted to be ambitious. I knew that I had a lot of career, desire. I knew that there was this part of me that I really wanted to pursue. But then I also knew I wanted to be a parent and I wanted to be a mom, and I, I come from a community where like my mom was a caretaker, right? Like she worked like she honestly worked part-time when my sister and I were growing up, right? And so, I had only really seen women who took on that full-time caregiver role, right? And so as I'm like swirling through, who do I want to be at this moment in my life? What is actually going to serve me, right? I think what was super important was that I needed to have someone kind of help me reorient and think about who I needed to be, right? Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to get there, to be honest, as my husband was like, you should definitely check out career coaching. And I was like, no, you never want to listen to your spouse or your partner, obviously. Yeah. But then I actually ended up talking to a bunch of very seasoned professional women in different parts of the startup world. And when I tell you that every single one of them was like, get a career coach. They were like, it is so important to build your support systems. Mm-hmm. It is so important to have people who are in your corner who are going to remind you of who you want to be, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that was so invaluable to me. And I think kind of going back to your passion statements, Kendall, like your passion statements and your it's fine life, your better than fine life lives inside of you. You deep down, right? Like as we are like, I'm confused. I don't know who I am. I'm lost. Like, I'm not even kidding. I would like lay in bed every night and tell my husband, like, I'm so lost. And he's like, you have no idea what a lost person looks like. Yeah. You're just not a lost person. Right. No. But I didn't have it in me, right? In that moment in time, I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the resources, right? To really understand like what my big grand life could look like. And so having someone like Kendall, my coaches for her, it was the big A agenda, right? So for her, it's like, what is like the defining statement of your life, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, the defining statement of my life is that I want to live as authentically as possible. And I want to encourage other people to live as authentically as possible.
Love that.
That is the statement of my life. That is the mission of my life. And so everything that I do, including my career, and we'll focus just on my career, means that I need to be able to work in a place that allows me to be authentic. I need to be able to encourage people around me to be authentic, right? And I think, Kendall, like the passion statements are excellent, right? Because that allows you to really kind of narrow down, like, what is it that you really need at this moment of time in your life? And the thing that I will say about all of this is that you're changing and evolving all the time. So as you unlock, right, new things about yourself, your 6 passion statements might change, right? Mm-hmm. Like I know right now, like it's very important to me to have balance. It's very important to me to be operational, to have, client sales, focusing relationships, right? But that might change, as my family evolves, as I evolve, right? And I think having that type of support system and really just define, support system can go beyond a coach, right? Like it can be like the meal prep, it can be the cleaning services, it can be the nanny, it can be all these different things, right? But like, I think the have it all mentality for women is kind of flawed in the sense because I think it forgets to include like having it all means having like a ton of support. And like when you think about like, I come from a communal culture, right? And so, in Indian culture, when I was growing up, it wasn't just my mom raising me, right? It was my mom, my dad, my grandparents, my aunties, my church community, right? Like I remember growing up and having all these people around me, right? And like, I think it's a little different, when we think of like where I am today, like I don't necessarily live by my family. So like, I'm constantly evaluating like, what is the support system that I need in this moment, right? Wow. And being really aware that like, yes, I can have it all, but I have to invest in like the system around me to have it all, right? And it means that sometimes I won't be able to cook dinner every night. And sometimes it means that I won't be able to clean my house every week, right? Like I have to really think about and create grace and compassion for yourself in the midst of that.
Yeah. So I have 2 thoughts. So first is for anybody who's watching the video and just watched my husband walk up. So speaking of support systems, we got in Starbucks.
Amazing.
Yay. Podcast guest host. But to your point, Rachel, like part of the reason I was fist pumping. So I went to a women's expo. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And the executive, I don't know what her title was, talent picker for NBC, the one who had chosen CSI to air on television, Like,
Wow.
talk about a show to have ownership over.
Yeah.
She got up on stage. She was this huge women's conference. And the first words out of her mouth were, "You cannot have it all." She goes, "I'm going to be honest with you, as a CEO, as someone who has run businesses, as somebody who has been successful, you will miss something.
Man.
Lying to yourself that you can be a full-time hands-on homeschooling mom and a CEO of a company and run a bakery shop out of your kitchen at the same time you raise chickens is just not feasible. It's not happening."
Yeah.
And she was like, "You have to build your support systems.
Yes.
You may miss a soccer game to become a CEO. Your kid won't because you have a support system in place, but like you cannot always be everywhere." And it was such a fascinating talk that I listened to, because I always think, well, I can do everything.
Yeah.
Of course I can. And she was like, "You cannot. You have to have infrastructure in place to fill in the gaps. You cannot be everywhere all at once." And it's really had an impact on my life, because it was right around the time I was about to have my daughter. And I remember thinking, like, but I don't want to miss the soccer game.
Yeah.
And up until that stage of my life, I was going to be a CEO. Like, come hell or high water, it was going to happen. And in that moment, I made the realization that, like, maybe that's not what I want. To your point, something in me shifted that said, okay, maybe I need to reassess what my boundary limitations are. Maybe I need to reassess what level of seniority I want to get to. Maybe I need to set up an infrastructure and a system to support me in what I'm trying to accomplish. And it was a shift for me. Now, she wasn't wrong, right? Like, you cannot clone yourself.
Yeah.
And I respect that. And she wrote a book called, and I think I have it on my bookcase. I'm looking for it now, but it said, like, things I'll tell my daughter. And it was like all the things she didn't get to say to her daughter when her daughter was growing up, because she was like a workaholic, like living in the office.
Wow.
And it was such a good reminder that, like, to your point, when you're evaluating a job, you're evaluating your life.
Oh, yeah.
And you're making choices. And that doesn't make anyone's choices better or worse than anybody else's if it fits their lifestyle. But you got to build systems, you got to build infrastructure, and you got to honestly evaluate what you want.
And you got to own it, man. Like, it's okay if you, like, love being in the workplace and you miss your kid's soccer game. Like, truly. Yeah. Like, I had a friend who is currently, you know, about to have a baby. And, you know, one thing that she was sharing with me is that she loves she's a full-time influencer, right? She's been building her business, and she's really, honestly, very, very good at it, right? Yeah. But she was talking to someone, and as she's evaluating this moment of time in her life, right? This person told her, happy kids have happy parents.
Ooh.
And honestly, I think that is so true. And I just, like, personally, this is like the mission of my podcast, is the mission of my life, right? Be authentic to who you are. If you want to, like, climb the corporate ladder and that's going to bring you a ton of joy, and that means that you might miss out on some things, build the system so that you can live with yourself, right? You know, to give, like, a kind of a silly example, right? Like, I recently have completely switched over to using a service called Cook Unity, which is like a meal kit service. Basically, I knew what was important to me is I need to be able to eat healthy because it makes me feel good. So, like, balanced meals, full meals. And what was happening is that because both my partner and I are navigating, like, busy jobs, we have a ton going on. It would be 6 p.m. and we're like, what can we eat? We're pulling chicken nuggets out of the fridge. We're pulling, you know, processed food. And, like, I just wasn't feeling good, you know, like, in my body. And so then I started looking into different services, and this Cook Unity service was awesome because it allowed me to be able to just pop something in the oven, right? And in 15 minutes, I had a balanced meal. It had, like, the calorie count, you know, it has all the different things. Like, if you're looking for something that's a bit more balanced, it has all of that kind of built in, right? Is it a little bit more expensive? Yeah, for sure. It definitely is more expensive every week compared to, like, you know, your $50 grocery haul, right? But that time that's opened up for me, one, I don't have pressure on myself to be like, I need to cook a balanced meal for my family right now, right? Yeah. It's taken away, like, you know, I can, like, work until, like, 6 o'clock, 6:30, right? Or, you know, with the saved time, I'm able to then dedicate some time to my podcast and editing, right? Because it's like, okay, we can have, like, a nice meal and sit together, and, like, the food freaking tastes good, right? Like, it's awesome. You know, it's awesome, right? But, like, I also had to not feel bad that like I wasn't able to, you know, be a traditional homemaker for my family, right? Like that's a silly example because I don't feel that bad about that. But I know that there are other things like not being able to show up for your kid's soccer game or not being able to care for an aging parent or whatever it might be, right? That can make you feel like you should be giving up the things that really matter to you, right? But like what matters to me and what I hope folks, as you're listening to this, is evaluate what matters to you and then freaking own it. Be okay that other people might not value what you value. And there's nothing wrong with you valuing what you value and Kendall valuing what she values and I valuing what I value, right? That's how women can support each other, right? Is by allowing each other the space to be who they need to be and live authentically as who they are.
I so love that, Rachel. And I feel like our conversations are always just full of all these nuggets of wisdom, right? Like today's call alone, I think we've touched on like 52 things you can do to bring more satisfaction to your career and your life, which I love. But I'm so excited we got to talk about this. We got to bring authenticity to the workplace. We got to talk about evaluating your needs and where you're at in your career. And then really just about navigating like tech and the systems that exist within our organization. So it's been amazing having you on the podcast, Rachel. We'll have to have you back because I feel like we could talk about this for probably like 3 years straight and everybody would just get used to it. But I so appreciate you being on. Thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, no, it was so fun. I always have fun chatting with you. I feel like we share so much in common. So I hope to all your listeners, be authentic to who you are, right? Please find space to really evaluate who you are and what you need. Like you deserve that. You deserve that time for yourself, you know? And when you do that, I think so many doors, professionally, personally, all of it will open. So thanks, Kendall. I hope you continue to inspire people with the light of all the things that you're sharing with them.
Awesome. I appreciate